We're connecting with Facebook, so good morning on Facebook. As we're just getting started this morning, I'm going to say a little hello. My name is Liz Erlewine, and I am the Visual Arts Director here at Crooked Tree Arts Center in Petoskey, Michigan. I'm so glad that you are able to join us for this next Coffee at 10. Today's event, as you can tell, is virtual only, so we're so glad that you're able to join us here in Zoom or by Facebook. And our schools were closed this morning because of icy roads. So it was a good, safe call that we made, making this event just virtual for today. I think we're rolling in and I'm pretty much here in Zoom. Again, hello on Facebook. If you have any questions or comments during today's presentation or conversation, you can feed them into the chat in Zoom. We also have the Q&A feature enabled in Zoom. I'll be keeping an eye on that. So if you just have anything you want to say or questions you want to ask, just put them right in there and we'll feed them into the conversation. Facebook will try to keep an eye on you, but I know a lot of our guests on Facebook check it out after the fact. So please still let us know what you think and what questions and comments you have for Kelly, because we love to hear from you there as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. My guest today is Kelly Ingleright-Telgenhoff. And she's going to tell us about her work. And by way of introduction, I just want to share with you that I invited Kelly here today because she's an artist who I wasn't familiar with until we put together a couple of juried exhibitions here at Crooked Tree Arts Center in Petoskey, Michigan. Kelly submitted to 2 shows. One was a regional Great Lakes area show called This Is Home, and the other one is called Open Doors, which was a national call. Both of these shows are currently open to the public, so do come in and see us. If you're in the northern Michigan area, pop in and see us in Petoskey. I was so taken with Kelly's work because the work not only is really well rendered. I mean, I think you'll look at these pieces and be impressed just with this skill and ability that Kelly has as a painter, but they're really provocatively simple images as well. And so they're almost deceptive in the sense that you look at something and you think you get it, and then you spend a little bit longer and it really pulls you in and asks you to ask questions of the artwork. So we actually have several pieces of Kelly's on display because she's in both shows. And so since you won't get to see them in person today, come and see it another time. But we'll get to hear a little bit more about those pieces and her work in general during today's conversation. And Kelly's piping into us from the Clarkston area in Michigan, right? And Kelly has a background as a practicing artist and painter, but also a teacher. And she teaches for Western Michigan University and also for a school down in Texas. So she's used to this Zoom environment here with us today. And so I'm really excited, Kelly, for you to share with us just kind of the thoughts that go behind your own creative practice and whether even some of that teaching and your experience in art history kind of informs what you're doing. So I guess with that, a virtual welcome to Kelly. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you very much, Liz. I really appreciate it. I guess to maybe get started here, as Liz said, my work is very simple and it's deliberately designed to be that way. I like to take an everyday object, something that you would really just pass by and not pay attention to, and I like to make it so that that object becomes elevated. It kind of transcends into being something much greater than the sum of its parts. And that's really what very good art does. You might see something, very simple, or it could be even something very complex. And if that artwork transcends and becomes more than the sum of its parts, it means that that artist has actually done something quite significant and quite profound. And that's kind of what I tend to try to do. It doesn't always work. Sometimes things get thrown off to the side. It's like, well, I'll deal with that, at some other point. Not everything works out that way, but many things do, and the more that I've painted, the more the less I tend to trash things. Let's put it that way, but anyway, that does happen to probably most every artist, where you kind of have to put things off to the side. But the other part of this is that I'm also going for multiple meanings. Most of the works that you folks will see today have multiple meanings. I'm usually going for three, almost like a three-layered meaning. Sometimes there are things that have more meanings than that. I'm usually going for the obvious, and usually I'm going after, like I said, simple everyday objects that are kind of manufactured, things that you just would blow past, you know, in your everyday life. But most of my stuff will have a feminist log into it because I'm an academic painter and I work within an academic institution. I tend to have another layer that will come through. I try to hide it in some ways, or I kind of keep it masked so that if someone is actually slowing down and taking some time with my work, they'll eventually find it or assume that there's something in there. And you folks will see that in a little bit as well. And then I often will pick up either a political or a social aspect, which feminism does kind of run in that direction, but sometimes there are other things that I'm referencing that are sometimes a little bit more personal with me. But again, I try not to hammer people over the head with whatever it is that I'm trying to do. It's a little more subtle, and it's kind of like you kind of have to dance around with the work a little bit. And I often tell my students, I'm sort of like an ogre. I have a lot of layers. You know, if you guys have ever watched Shrek, you know, the movie Shrek, and Shrek says, you know, well, ogres have many layers. Well, that's kind of what I say to my students as well. You should have many layers. You know, this should be complex. You know, sometimes art is just for the sake of art and the sake of beauty, but even beauty has a level of meaning involved with it too. So that's one part of my work. The other part, as we go through the presentations here, or the slides that I'm showing you folks, you'll also notice, and I don't know why I do, well, I think I do know why I do this, but I'm very haunted. My work tends to have a haunted quality, and it probably has to do with where I grew up. I grew up in Cadillac, Michigan, actually. I grew up in that area. So I'm from up north, as we call it, the up north, you know. But anyway, I came from a very, very poor family. So there's a level of haunting and some other things, you know, kind of stretched into this as well. And a lot of my work will feel almost as though sound has been sucked right out of it. It's all, and I like that, but I'm not sure why I do that. So I haven't actually figured out everything about me either. But anyway, that gives you a good idea as far as what I'm working with. So this first slide that you folks are looking at, this one, I like blue and whiteware. I like French, I like the English, and I like Chinese blue and whiteware. And my house is pretty much decorated in that particular aspect, at least 9 months out of the year. This particular blue and white vessel, what I did was it's actually just a vessel that's not much more than about like this tall. And that handle that you're seeing there isn't much more than, oops, here we go, about this big. So I blew it up to being quite large. I think this one is like 30 by 40 inches. So you're looking at something that was only really this big. It ends up being like this big on the canvas. So I like going in for this close focus. I do work heavily with a photorealism sort of style, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. But I also sometimes work in kind of a surrealist quality as well, and we'll talk about that in just a second too. But most of the things that you folks will see here, I tend to work in a series of 3 or 5. For some reason, I tend to do that. After about 5, I don't do it anymore because I'm starting to break down the pattern or whatever. I find that I get too loose, which may not be a bad thing. Maybe I need to focus in on being a little looser, but anyway, it's almost as though my muscle pattern has learned the technique or the process, and then I get bored with it, so then I move on. So you know, but you guys folks will notice that I work with basically 3 and 5. So that's what you folks are seeing here is this blue and white vessel number 2. It's actually the second iteration that I did of this one. It takes a long time to do this one. It is oil on canvas. Since about 2020, I've actually stopped painting on canvas most of the time, unless it's a really large painting, which there are a couple of really, at least one really large one at Crooked Tree. It's called Oblivion, and that one I had to go with canvas. it's very heavy to work with a board, going at a 6-footer, 5 feet by 5 feet or what have you. So it ends up being a little bit more cumbersome, and the weight of it is a little too much. So then I kind of switch back to the canvas, or fairly heavy canvas at that. So what I'm going to do is show you folks the next slide here. I apologize for the sheer amount of writing. I didn't really want to do that to you folks, but it sometimes helps me stay on track because I tend to wander a little too much. I currently, as Liz had said, I do work for 2 universities, Western Michigan University and also Tarleton State University with the Texas A&M system. And then my degrees are over on the left-hand side too. Liz had asked if I would perhaps talk about how did I become interested in painting in the first place. It was completely accident, utterly an accident. I never had art in high school. I did not take it in college either until way later. When I went to college, I'm a history major. I have a master's degree in history, and I loved history, but I also realized I wasn't going to be the best historian on the planet. And so I was kind of bummed out in my graduate work, and I started kind of dabbling, and actually I started out with Bob Ross. He was kind of my way to begin the whole thing, and I had no money in grad school or in undergrad, but I loved painting. It was kind of an escape. So I think for many of us, painting is kind of an escape from those pressures that we have. It's just something to enjoy perhaps in life. And then what happened was I accidentally took an art history course while I was in graduate school for my master's degree in history. It was like the heavens opened up and the angels began to say, it's like, oh my gosh, I love this. This is what I meant to do. And it is what I was meant to do, because I do still teach art history. What my thought was, okay, I know, we all love Bob Ross, and he's such a fantastic, was such a fantastic individual, but I knew that, this style wasn't really what was trending or what have you. So what I thought, I'm going to take these art history courses as a means to maybe make myself a better painter. Well, it wound up, I was really good at art history, and I really enjoyed it. And so the painting went off to the side, and I then focused on art history, and I went to Indiana University for my PhD. I also spent some time at Michigan State getting ready to make the jump to Indiana University for the PhD. I didn't finish my PhD, unfortunately. I wound up what's called ABD, means all but dissertation, because I had to go back to work. Money ran out. It's super expensive to get doctoral degrees. Even with all the funding that Indiana gave me, I still didn't have enough. My husband also has a PhD, not in this particular area. He's in the sciences, he's in medicine, which makes a lot more money than my field, but so I wound up kind of off to the side. Well, we had to move to Texas after my husband had finished his PhD. I had to leave my PhD behind because I was at the dissertation writing stage, and I figured, well, we'll move and I'll just finish writing. Well, I had to go back into the field and work. So I was working as a professor, as a teacher as well at universities. But we left Michigan. We left Michigan just before the economic collapse that took place between 2004 and 2008. There were no jobs here, so we left and we went to Texas. So we spent the last 13 years in Texas. We've only been back in Michigan about 3 years. Well, we left, and I left my PhD, and I told my husband, I said, either when we move to Texas, I have to finish that degree, and I'll just find a way to finish it down there, or the deal is this: I go back to school for an MFA. I went back to school for an MFA in Texas. So I come out of the University of North Texas, which is a very good school for art. They produce quite a few very, very trendy individuals. So I really appreciate the education that I received there. So that's how I wound up in this very off side or approach to getting an art degree. So, you know, you don't always have to start in the art field, and that, you know, sometimes it just grows into in your path, I suppose, or becomes a part of your path. So that's how that all happened. Now, Liz has also brought up the fact, actually in the introduction for this particular presentation, or, you know, our coffee together, she stated that my work looks very classical, and it does. I actually, as an art historian, started out as a Renaissance historian, Renaissance and Baroque. My painting tends to be very academic in that particular approach too. I do work from a photograph quite frequently, but I set up all of my props. I set up everything. Matter of fact, the egg pictures that you see here, the egg picture that is on the lower right hand corner, that is actually a photograph that I took. I set it up in my kitchen with all the lighting and so forth. Then the egg picture that you see over on the left hand side, upper left, that is actually my painting. Now, it's not from this particular one, but it's from another photograph. So I was just trying to show you folks, you know, how you can work from a photograph, and I still work from a photograph. I'm a little more willing to push outside that limit, but it's usually when I'm working with encaustic, not when I'm working with oil painting. The oil painting, I'm still kind of connected to that photograph. So what I do is I set up my props and put everything together, and then I draft out with a black and white photo of my work, because I want to see all those nuances of the shades and values that are part of my work. So again, that makes me very traditional in my approach. Then what I do an underpainting, which an underpainting just means that you're either using maybe black, it could be Payne's gray, or it could be like a burnt umber, and I paint in all the shadows and so forth. It's basically a black and white image. Then I go over top of it and I begin putting the color on top of it. So again, that's a very academic approach. It's very traditional. I must say that the universities that I came out of, University of North Texas, did not want me to do that. They wanted me to do something else. But I pushed hard enough that, you know, they let me continue on. What I had to do, because it's such a traditional approach, I had to find new ways to use this very old academic tradition. So anyway, I do have that very traditional approach. I also work with a lot of glazes too. I brought in some of my materials in here. At least I thought I did. Oh, I bet you I left my liquid and so forth out in the other room. Well, anyway, what happens is, if you took a cross section of my paintings, you would see that there might be as many as 20 layers of paint, maybe even 30 layers of paint, because I paint with a lot of glazes, which just means that I'm putting a little bit of pigment into like some sort of a material. It could be, you know, your turpenoid or turpentine, it could be liquid, whatever. So I'm just putting on one glaze after another, let it dry and so forth. So a fairly large painting can sometimes take me 2 or 3 weeks, you know, to finish it. So I have some that take as much as a month, depending upon how many layers I have on those as well. And it takes a long time for oil to dry too. So, but you can use actually those same techniques as well with acrylic. Most of my students use acrylic because it's easier to work with. It's so much better. It's easier on the environment. I have to be really careful using the oil just because I can't just take it and dump it out in my backyard. You know, it poisons your water systems. So I have to be careful about, you know, doing the recycling that I need to do with it, you know. So I generally try to steer my students toward acrylic, which is a little bit different learning curve. But if they really want the oil, then they can always use the oil too. So anyway, that's kind of what's happening here. Liz, do we have any questions or anything, or are we good? Can I go on to my next slide?
I don't see other people asking questions, but I did wonder if you could speak a little bit about that notion of describing yourself as an academic painter. So some of the things that have come up in your intro so far are just, you know, all of these different formal university influences on the work that you're creating. At the same time, you describe yourself as an academic painter, but that the current academy doesn't promote that way of working. Can you kind of explain that maybe to folks who aren't painters and don't work in that realm?
Right. In the academic world, actually, kind of a classic example of this. About a week ago, my sister-in-law came down to see me, and she was looking at my work. And I had commented on a particular painting. I said, "Oh, I don't like that one." I said I had to paint it for the university, and they didn't like it, and blah blah blah. She said, "Can't you paint whatever you want?" Like, no. No, you do not get to paint whatever you want. What happens in the academic world is that you have to come up with something new. Particularly in a master's program, getting an MFA, it means you have to invent something different because you have to produce something that is different than anybody else has produced, hopefully across the globe. So it means that just like a scientist, if they were trying to get their MFA or a PhD, they would have to come up with something new. They have to invent something new. It could be very, very small as far as the movement towards something new, but the same thing kind of happens in academia. The exact same thing happens in academia with getting an MFA in painting. So you don't really get to paint the way that you necessarily want to. You can, and my way is to work with that photograph and so forth. But really what the university is looking for is something what kind of trendy. However, I did have one professor tell me, I was struggling. It was my first semester into graduate school. And one of my professors, I was trying to do something that wasn't me. You could clearly tell it wasn't me. But I was trying to make my professors happy. I was trying to get my A, and turned out I still wound up with a B in that class. I was not happy with that, but it happens. It was my first semester in. And this very sage professor, he said to me, he said, "Kelly, stay true to yourself. Trends come and go. They'll come and go." He said, "But you have to stay true to yourself." And he said, the true to yourself is really, you are a photorealism painter, but it's already been done. It came up in the 1970s and 1980s. He said, so that's gone. So he said, now you have to figure out, how do I use what I'm really good at? And he said, very few people can do what you do. He said, most students today don't have the patience to do what you can do. So he said, now how do you take that and make it bigger, better? And wow, he said, anybody can paint, a bouquet of flowers, or anybody can do this. And he said, well, he said, actually, not everybody can. He said, from the technical aspect, most people don't have that today. He said, you have so many tools in your toolbox. Now take it and make it even different, So that's really what had to happen. So what I wound up doing, often when you think of a still life, which these two are examples of still life, it's just an inanimate object. Well, still lifes in the traditional sense were always pretty small and so forth. So what I do is I blow them up to being 6-footers. That was my way of saying, I still have the technical capability of wowing you and, showing you I can make these textures and these forms, but I'm going to do it as a 6-footer because still life, it isn't supposed to be a 6-footer. And what I want you to do is to walk through all of this, gooey stuff that's part of that egg, and so forth. And then I also had to kind of figure out, how can I link into this some symbolism, how do I make it mine? So it was a struggle. It was very, very difficult. It took me almost a year. I had all of the technical training, but it took a year for me to find where I could, who I was, is symbolically, and what am I going to put forth in order to make these academic paintings and make them transcend, make them become more than just an egg in a Pyrex bowl. How do you do that? So, and sometimes I have to do that with my titles. Sometimes it comes through with the titles for me. For example, the one here with this egg, this cracked egg that's in a Pyrex bowl, it's called The Ties That Bind. I did a series of 3 of these. I have 3 brothers. So each one of the eggs kind of represented my brothers. And it also represented sometimes hurt or damaged relationships. Sometimes, family, sometimes we say things to each other that we're not, it's like, wow, why did I do that? So sometimes hurt or crackness, will tend to come with that, or, but yet there's a container kind of holding us together because, we're family, and sometimes you have to go back and say, hey, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. So that's kind of what I'm referencing with regard to the academic stage of this, making that one very simple thing elevate to become something much bigger. So did that answer the question, Liz?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't know if you feel this way, but just hearing you talk through that whole process of having that sort of frustration, and a comment in the chat popped up saying like, oh, it's interesting, that complex kind of stifling of creativity.
Yes.
Yet it really did blossom into something more, right? So,
yes.
So it's an interesting process. But
yes.
Why don't you go ahead and move along? Let's
okay. Yeah, I cried for about the first year of graduate school. I cried every day when I went home, not because I couldn't master the techniques. I could master the techniques. It was, how do I make those techniques become greater than the sum of its parts? This series was the one that was the breakthrough where I didn't cry anymore. It was the one in graduate school where it's like, I arrived, and my professors knew I arrived at this point too. So typically, like I said, I work in a series of 3 or 5, and I have 3 actually of this one as well, with these raw chickens. Actually, I was really mad at my professors. So, because they kept saying, stop making things beautiful, stop making things beautiful. I'm like, all right, then I'm going to take something ugly. So I took a raw chicken. I mean, I literally had a raw chicken slapped up on my, it was my kitchen island, and I put, lights on it. I made my husband hold it up this way. It took photographs of it in all different, views. We did use the chicken, so it didn't go to waste. Matter of fact, everybody at school had asked, they said, did you use that chicken? You didn't just throw it out. I said, nope, I did the shots very quickly, and I usually take about 100 different photographs, and then I pick the top 3, well, usually the top 5, and then I kind of combine them from there and get what I want out of the whole thing. So anyway, what I was after with this is like, how do you take something so gross and yucky, as a raw chicken, and make somebody enamored by it? Well, keep in mind, I was in Texas at the time, so this is kind of like going to lead into the story that comes with this. So I picked the ugly chicken, but I put water around everything. I was really missing Michigan at this point. We had been living in Texas probably 10 years at this stage. We missed water. When you're not around water, and if you grew up on water, oh my gosh, it's like, this is a dry state, it was very difficult. So we always missed water. So I wound up putting water underneath the chicken as a means to kind of pay homage, to Michigan, to my home state. So most of my work now actually does have a lake underneath it, or it will have water underneath it. It's my way of, coming back to Michigan, because not only did I miss it when you're in Texas, but, I love it here, as well, the water part of it. So in this particular case too, I was using complementary colors. You can see the blue to the orange, sort of to create a little bit of dynamism in there as well. I also tend to have different influences. I like surrealism, and I really like Salvador Dali, and he paints quite a bit with cerulean blue and kind of like an orangey color as well. He tends to like that, so that's why I kind of picked up on that. And you kind of have this weird seascape, like, why is this raw chicken on this beach, and why is it all trussed up? Well, usually I pull these 2 were, well, actually there's a third one too, and I ask my students, what do you think this means? I'm like, well, that chicken is really bound up. And I'm like, yeah, so what does that mean? And like, well, that chicken's kind of vulnerable too, and it's alone, and it feels lonely. I said, yeah, I was so far away from my family at the time. Both my husband and I, we both come from Michigan. We come from the west side. My husband comes from Grand Rapids, and I come from Cadillac, as I mentioned. And I said, we're alone in Texas. I said, no, we have friends, but I said, it's not the same as your family sometimes. And so I said, sometimes I really miss them. And I said, my mom won't travel to come see us because she's terrified of leaving where she comes from. I said, so that's why this chicken is kind of trussed up too, because it's scared to leave what it's familiar with. And I said, have you ever heard of people, the saying, what's wrong with you? Are you chicken? I said, well, that's kind of what I was in graduate school. I was really afraid to push the envelope. So I kind of saw myself as a chicken in some ways and kind of bound by tradition. And then I decided, no, I'm going to break free from that as well. So, and then the other thing that came with it, I don't eat red meat. I still eat chicken. So there's guilt involved with this one too. So it's kind of my political aspect of it. It's like, gosh, I wish I could stop eating chicken, but I don't. I still eat chicken and fish. So there was a little bit of a political aspect that was kind of, or social aspect that was kind of kind of drawing into this too. So like I said, Dolly is an influence in this weird kind of dreamy landscape that doesn't really quite make sense, but it almost feels like you've been there before. That's kind of what I'm going after. Odd Neerdum is a Norwegian painter. He is actually functions today. He's a very wealthy Norwegian painter along with it. But I liked his background. So my backgrounds kind of pick up similar to his, and then the color aspect is kind of a Dali influence. But again, it was about, my whole lesson in this was, how do I make this chicken become more than just a raw chicken? And how does it increase to become more than the sum of its parts? So that's kind of what happened there. And I painted them very large. So it would be kind of like a still life and a landscape kind of jammed together, which is kind of an unusual thing as well. So that's kind of what I was working with there. Is it okay if I move on? Yep. Okay. And so again, the third one in that process, it's a little bit too orangey there on the right-hand side. But like I said, I like to take ugly things or things that we just ignore and make them transcend to become beautiful or interesting, like the gross raw chicken. And like I said, I kind of already gone through the meaning of the raw chicken on the beaches and so forth. I also like to work with, in this particular series too, folks, not only is there visual texture where I'm actually making it so it looks like, the little bumps on the skin of a chicken. So I'm giving you the visual texture through my technique, but there's actually actual texture in the background. I actually took, I put gesso on the canvas first, and then I took a comb and went across, and it's just very, very subtle, but there actually is some texture in there as well, some actual texture. So that was, again, me kind of playing with the material just a little bit.
Yeah, that's interesting for me to hear you say, because for those of you who have seen the works in person that are in the shows here, I really feel like that smooth surface is important to you. Can you talk a little bit more about surface? You can go ahead and move on to other images if you want.
Okay.
But I'm just curious about your thoughts of texture there.
Yeah, texture. What I was trying to do was, create some texture in there and make those works move in another direction. Because if you have texture on your surface, then you have to kind of overcome that texture as well in order to get that smooth or that visual texture that I'm trying to go for as well. So it was kind of blending two different ideas, and that really wound up being the thing that the professors that I was trying to please, they really enjoyed that, because it took it to another level by overcoming, whatever was in that texture, that actual physical texture, and then to make it so that I created an illusion that you actually couldn't see that texture too. So it was kind of a game. I was kind of playing a little bit of a visual game. This particular series was inspired in Texas, but I think it applies to anywhere in the United States. It's plastic getting caught in our environment. And every spring in Texas, and we were living in the Fort Worth area, so it's pretty flat. And every spring, the wind just whips across, and it's the month of March. It's like one of the most windy months. It's a great month to go flying your kite for sure. But what would happen is this big industrial plastic got caught in anything off the highway. And actually, I stopped on the highway and I went and I took the photographs of the picture of the paintings that you see here. So I was once again working from a photograph, and the sunlight was kind of coming in and glinting off of this plastic that got caught in these trees. And I felt like the trees were just struggling so much. There's a barbed wire fence in this for a reason. There is a bunch of longhorn cattle that you don't see in this. So I couldn't even go in and pull the stuff off. I mean, there was more plastic than I ever could have pulled off anyway. But there are longhorn in there, and I wasn't about to jump in that pasture with them. They're a lot bigger than I am. So anyway, but I thought that the series was kind of, or excuse me, the scenery was interesting because it's a social concern, a political concern in the fact of, you know, what happens to our environment with plastic and not taking care of that plastic. There's actually a third one with this as well as I don't have a photograph of it, or at least I couldn't find it, and it's sold, so I don't have it anymore. But anyway, that's kind of what inspired this particular work. And so many people walk past this, like when I'm in galleries and so forth, and their comment is, it's like those trees are just so struggling. They're struggling to try and survive. Or it's like even like a human being trying to get out of you know, being enclosed and being stuck. Now, keep in mind, I did do these while I was in graduate school too. So is it me struggling again? You know, I know this was at the end of my graduate career, or getting my MFA. One person actually at a show, he said, and I told him about this story. He said, you know, that one where it's all knotted up, he said, that's probably you being knotted up and feeling like you were stuck or you were trapped, you know, and, you know, kind of like bottleneck. Is that all of a sudden it's like it balloons out, your idea balloons out, and you move forward from there. I'm like, I never looked at that painting that way. I said, that's interesting. I said, the one that's on the left-hand side, that one, I always feel like that tree is me. And struggle and me trying to burst forth. And I said, I never thought about the bottlenecking. And then all of a sudden the ideas come forth and you balloon from there. I said, that's really good. I said, I want to use that. so it was kind of an interesting thing. But anyway, that's what happened there. And I really enjoyed, I don't enjoy the fact of, you know, the destruction of our landscapes. But trying to capture the concept of plastic is a little challenging, and it's a very interesting process as well. But anyway, the big thing is go pick up the plastic so that we don't hurt our environment, you know. But I cannot tell you how many people actually stop by these in you know, art shows and so forth, and they're like, I really like this. And these are very large paintings too. So it's like you can walk right out into that, you know, that landscape and be a part of it. And you guys are actually seeing real Texas landscape there. That's what it looks like in the middle of March. So a little different than our landscape. But anyway, that's happens there. Sometimes I like random objects too. The scene that you folks are looking at over on the left-hand side, this is also from Texas. I don't know if any of you folks know what that crazy thing is in the landscape. Liz, do you know what that thing is?
I don't.
No, it is a cattle feeder.
Oh,
And
no.
no, I didn't know what it was either. I went and I took a photograph of it because I was so, you know, I was out on the highway again. I'm like, what the heck is that thing? I've never seen something like that. Well, it has like this big umbrella over top of it to keep the feed from getting wet, because then it starts to sprout. Which I didn't know. It took somebody else to, you know, tell me that's what this is. Well, what it reminded me of was one of those old Victrolas, like, you know, the music comes out of. And so that's why I named it Are You Listening? Was because it kind of for me, it kind of referenced that. But what my professor, one of my favorite professors, he said, Kelly, he said, that's you. He said, you pick a single object, and he said that object becomes you every time. And he said, that's really good. And you know, and he liked it very much. It turned out this particular painting went to another graduate student. We swapped paintings. So, and this one was big. It was over 75 inches long. So it was a very, very large painting, one that I really enjoyed painting, and I'd like to do this one again because that landscape's kind of weird. It's kind of, again, it runs along the line of being surreal in some ways, you know, so it tends to work up that way. But again, I find these weird things on the highway. It's when I'm driving, that's when I see weird stuff, you know. So particularly in Texas, I saw more weird objects out in the middle of these open fields than you can imagine. The work that's over on
is that one sort of a composite? Did you invent and bring together then? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, the landscape is completely from my mind. It's completely me imagining it, and the colors too. But the object itself, when I, you know, work from a photograph, so I took a photograph of it, got as close as I could, because again, there were a bunch of longhorn in that area. So, you know, put on a scope so that I could go in as far as I could, and then took the photograph, and then I just, you know, took that shape and then plunked it into that scene that you see there. So yeah, that's how that one worked. The one over on the right hand side here, so I'm going to see if I can move. Yeah, I can move the two of us. That one actually came from a fellow graduate student, in the sense of, this is his sculpture. We had to do a big show, all of us that were graduating, and we had to produce something for the show. Well, this sculpture is what he put together. He was ticked off. I can use some other words to describe his attitude. He did not want to do this. So he threw some components together and did this. At first I was like, I don't like this. You know, it's this beaten up, ratty lounge chair that you would use, or, you know, chair that you would use. It's kind of plasticky outside. And, but the thing is, my family had tons of those. I don't know if you guys, you know, do you remember the plastic ones? You know, they almost have like a tube-like quality in their plastic. And I think everybody across the nation has had something like this. It doesn't matter where you come from. So this came up in Texas, you know, again. Well, he, you know, secured this big fan off the top of this thing. There's a garden hose underneath it, and then 4 cinder blocks. Well, the first thing that came to my mind is, you know, those big fan boats that you take across like a Louisiana swamp? That's what it reminded me of, and it's kind of broken and disheveled. And then it also reminded me a little bit of a king's throne, or the throne, you know, of God, or something like that. A lot of things that I lecture on as a historian. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like a dais of some sort. And so I started to like his work. So I asked Zach, so that's why this is called Zach's chair. I said, Zach, would you care if I took photographs? Can I paint this? And he's like, I've never had a painter ask me for anything, because the painters were always kind of classified as being a little more arrogant than the rest. I'm like, this is cool. I said, this means so much to me. It meant like 3 different layers. It reminded me of my grandparents, because my grandparents had that chair. My grandparents would sit outside all the time on their porch, and they also had a garden with a garden hose, and they lived in a trailer, and the trailer was bumped up on these big cinder blocks. So everything in this meant something about my grandparents. A lot of my best memories are with my grandparents. You know, they would take me out and go get me a kite, and we would fly it, you know, in March or whatever. And my grandparents were kind of a paradox. They had a little bit of money, not a lot, just a little bit. They lived much more comfortably than what my family did. But they never showed off that money. They were very, very, you know, kind of closed off with that. So this really kind of reminded me of those lovely memories with them. It reminded me of the art history and a big throne that is being broken down. And then it reminded me of those Louisiana boats. So it had 3 different things kind of moving around with it. And the way that I perceived it, what's interesting is I show this in various venues, from art festivals to high-end art galleries. This work stops people every single time. They laugh. They're like, oh my gosh, so-and-so would love it. Do you remember when we had a chair like this? You know, it means something to everybody. And I think I like that when it speaks to people, because, you know, I think we all have passed through the broken down chair things in life. This is also oil on canvas. I'm now starting up actually the third one. The first one that I painted, the one that you're seeing there, I gave to Zach as a thank you for letting me paint this. The second one sold to a young woman in Chicago last summer. I'm now painting the third one, so I really love this one. It's the hardest thing I've ever painted, to be honest. Is the other than the chickens aren't very easy either. This one's really hard to get all of the lines in correctly so that you're looking at it from the right angle and so forth. So I really enjoy it from that perspective. Do you guys have any questions at this point? Everybody's cool?
Go ahead and feed your questions or comments into the chat and Q&A. We're happy to add them to the conversation.
Okay, I'll go on. And again, just random everyday objects, as I'd mentioned to you folks before. Three's a Crowd. That particular one is actually in the gallery with Liz as well. I have two different iterations of it. The Three is a Crowd actually represents my brothers. Like I said, I have three brothers, so I just painted this very simple bowl of eggs. You know, again, something you're not really going to pay attention to, but I put it into a Salvador Dali sort of background where it's kind of abstract, weird, eerie kind of feeling, and it still has kind of a beachy feel, which is again Michigan, the connection to Michigan with this as well. So I'm going to go on because I figure probably our time is getting close here. This one is called The Lean, which we also have an iteration of this at Crooked Tree. This one actually started out with some feminist ideology attached to it, and then it changed as I was painting it. And this one came through during graduate school. I think I've now painted 10 of these. So I have 10 different iterations because they sell so quickly, which is a great thing overall. But anyway, this one started out, I was painting pears in grad school. It frustrated a lot of the millennial students because they're like, this is so boring. But what they didn't realize is what I was painting. It's about age. It's about women and women aging and imperfections that tend to be a part of us. And also the idea of what women are sometimes called, like often we're called pear-shaped, or and as we age, you know, sometimes the imperfections, or even just as a human being, we have imperfections too. And sometimes those imperfections are they tend to be emphasized too much. And so that's kind of what I was going after with this. Well, this work, it started out along that line, and then there were two pairs in it. And then I started realizing the one little pair in the background kind of seemed a little more masculine to me. It actually wound up representing my husband. And the front pair is me. And it's about having a good relationship is what this thing actually wound up morphing into. Usually in a good relationship, you know, one significant other will maybe go into the background while the other one takes the forefront, and then it sometimes switches, you know, and so forth. And it's kind of like a shared, really good relationship was kind of what I was going after with that. So anyway, it wound up becoming something different than what I originally had intended. It still has the feminist aspect to it and the idea of women and so forth, but I think it has more to do with relationships and sometimes to do with aging and aging relationships too. So that's really, go ahead.
It's really interesting to see your work and hear you talk about it, because it really does feel like you do a lot of self-portraits. I mean, yes. You go into it thinking that, or does it just inevitably happen?
It just inevitably happens. I never go in thinking about a self-portrait. I don't even want to paint myself. I don't even like seeing a photograph of me because I realize that I'm aging, you know, and I don't like it. And I don't look the way that I did when I was in my 20s. So I really don't want to see it. And so what's interesting is I must become the object. I think I become the object in the end. And so maybe that's where the magic happens, is because of that transformation, or the object becomes more than the sum of its parts, and you can feel that hauntedness, or that, personality, whatever it happens to be. So I was playing with complementary colors in this case. I like the red green. But I don't like it when it's Christmas colors, but it is Christmas colors, so I kind of try to offset it a little bit. But again, since about 2019, I have switched to boards, painting on boards. I actually prefer that over canvas because I can get a much tighter sort of approach with it.
Thanks for mentioning that, because we have a question in the chat about those boards. Can you tell a little bit about what specifically you've found that you like to paint on? Is this something you're constructing or purchasing prefab?
I'm purchasing it prefab. I think I've got a couple. Yeah, here we go. So this one is actually just an encaustic, but this is what the boards look like on the back side, and it's just the same birch board on the front. So, and then I just go through it and I gesso it up a lot. I usually put about 5 coats, sand it down, and then I begin painting. Painting on a board takes a little more than if you're painting on canvas. Canvas, because it has the warp and weft like the weave, it will hold your paint better. It takes more layers with the board. You have to be much more patient with the board. I put 5 layers of paint on before I begin doing my glazes. So it takes a lot of layers with this. You have to build it up a lot more than using the canvas. But I like the stiffness of that board because it's just so much better for me. Some people actually use masonite. Now, I've tried masonite and I don't work with it very well. I don't know if I was just maybe too young at the time when I was trying masonite. I might be more patient with it now, but I do tend to prefer a board. But I have seen a lot of artists use masonite. It's cheaper. It's actually cheaper to use a masonite board than the birch board that I'm using. And I just order it from Amazon. Amazon tends to be the cheaper route. If I go through Dick Blick, it's still a little more expensive. But sometimes I'll even find a board, out in the garage or something. It's like, hey, I can paint on that thing if I gesso that baby up. And, sometimes I can find things, and that's always nice too, because then it takes that item out of, the dump and that sort of thing. So it's less pollution. I do often work with, I worked with a photograph in this case. I set the pears up, put the lighting on them. I have 100 different pictures of this as well, along with it too, but just close focus that tends to come with it. What I would like to do, if it's okay with you folks, just a couple more pears. I won't go into these because I wanted to show you guys some experimental things. I do like to show that the pears going through rot, that they're starting to decompose. To me, it's like entropy. Entropy, the whole idea of all organized systems decay across time. And that's kind of what the human body does. We hit a certain point and then we begin to go through the process, of entropy. So I even named some of my stuff. And this one's called Entropy ×3. My photograph isn't very good. I'm sorry, folks. It stretched out. It went too strange. But sometimes I do work with other pair images. I do work along the line with vessels, looking at the vessels from the top, because it's an unusual sort of viewpoint as well. It's also very Buddhist. I'm going for a very Buddhist sort of feel where there's the nothingness and the bliss. Within the Buddhist tradition, a lot of times, we get hurt feelings because we have an ego. And if you can get rid of that ego, actually, and let it go, your feelings tend to get hurt a lot less, and so that's kind of what I'm referencing in these images, is the idea of going into the nothingness where there is no ego. It's a good thing to remind yourself when you're going through grad school and you're going through a critique that and you're being torn apart, which happens a lot, so this was my way of surviving some of the critiques that I went through. it helped me. It helped me get through. This is actually using that same idea of going into the nothingness, but this was inspired by one of my friends in graduate school. She was a ceramicist, and she made these things with holes in them. So this is actually a ceramic piece of hers, and this is a huge charcoal drawing. Most people don't like it. It sort of reminds me of a sea lamprey, so I don't like it either, but that's the whole idea, is that I'm kind of trying to creep people out a little bit with it. But again, I use something different with that whole process. What I wanted to do is show you guys some of the more experimental things, and what pushed me through graduate school too was experimenting this way. Here I'm actually combining, on the left-hand side, I'm combining wool with canvas and oil painting. And to my knowledge, up until the point, it was in 2016, I was the only person that I knew of that did this. And it was kind of part of my graduate work. I wish that I would have published it, because 1 year later, somebody else published it. Their work doing the same thing. But what I'm doing in that particular case is I'm taking wool like this. So you guys can see that it's just wool, and I have another one here, and I take the felting needles. I'm trying to get this in so that you guys can see it, and I'm actually popping the work on the left hand side. I'm popping from the top of it, so I've painted the work on a canvas, and this is oil painting, and then I am putting the colors of the wool into that as well. So it creates a little bit of a rupture. So it's a very different way of looking at things. The work that's on the, right-hand side. Was I saying the right-hand side for the left? No? Okay.
I know what you were talking about, so it's all good.
It's all okay. So on the right-hand side, that one, I've actually taken raw canvas like this. So it's just a raw piece of canvas. And now in that particular case, I actually stretched it on stretcher bars. But if you have a small enough piece, you could use a hoop, like an embroidery hoop. And what I do is I take this thing, here we go. So here's my needle, and I'm actually poking through from the back side. Whoops, that didn't hold very well for us. But here, this one will work a little better. So there's a pair. And what I'm doing, this is what the back side of it looks like. So you can see all of the colors. And what I'm doing is poking it through this way, okay? And so you're really working blind. So when I'm working with this and doing these things, I'm actually working, here, I'll stand up. I'm working like this and popping it through, so you actually have texture on this side. So that's kind of like a new experimental thing that I have been working with for a long time. So it's the same felting material, like if you were to make, you know, some sort of a vessel or something like that. It's the same thing, you know, just like felting, but I'm not putting the water through with it. I'm just adding that stuff or adding it to the canvas. I also work with encaustic, which has become my favorite thing, because the encaustic allows me to be more gestural, and it allows me to be more more loose and more like Van Gogh rather than being a Salvador Dali. You know, I get the texture with it and so forth. So you guys are looking at a couple of this one. It looks a little bit better here. So anyway, it's kind of a Texas landscape in this case. This is just a 9x12, but I really enjoy working with encaustic as well. And it sells really well because not everybody works with it. So I really enjoy it from that perspective. So it allows me to be a little more less tight, I guess, you know, and more gestural in my approach. So that's actually it with my presentation. Do you folks have any questions? And hopefully I haven't gone over too far.
No, we're good. We'll probably have just a couple minutes over with Q&A. We do have one question, and I'm not sure, we might need a little bit more from this guest if they're still there. The question is surrealism, cubism, abstract art forms proxies of realism? And
Yes. Yeah, matter of fact, when I teach surrealism, it is a form of realism. Yes, it's a form of it. But because it's an old system, I still ran into a problem in graduate school. I couldn't go just straight realism. I had to keep tweaking with this thing because I couldn't just do surrealism either. But yes, it is a form of it. Cubism does take something, it is a form of representational art, and cubism would be a type of realism, absolutely. And you're just taking it, pulling the item apart and, looking at it from many, many angles, almost like through shattered glass in some ways. And what was the other one? It was cubism,
Yeah,
surrealism, and
surrealism, cubism, and then just abstract art forms.
abstract cat. I'm thinking of Modigliani as kind of like an abstract painter. Yes, it could be. It's just a new way in all of those art forms. Cubism comes from basically about 1908 was when proto-cubism comes through. By 1910, 1911, we have cubism from Picasso. So that's, still that's in the early 20th century. So it's a very old system. Same thing with surrealism, comes through at about 1920, comes out of Dada. 1920, 1930s is kind of surrealism's heyday. It does stay popular into the 1940s, and then it falls off a little bit, and then is kind of now being picked up here and there. But you have to have a new twist to it. And then the other one was abstraction, which again, if you've abstracted anything, it just means that you're simplifying that object in some way or another. It remained popular even into the 1970s. And I would say even today, if you can throw a new spin on it, it can work. Yeah, absolutely. And it does can fall into the realism category. A lot of times people will use the term abstract to mean non-representational, and it's not the same. They are actually two different things. So did that answer the question?
I think so. Patricia, do you have other questions or follow-ups to that? If you do, go ahead and feed those into the chat. I guess as we come to a close here, please do, if you do have additional comments or questions, add them. But I just want to ask Kelly, it's been interesting to hear about this sort of struggle and finding your way through, and the different layers that go with each of your pieces. So you shared your experiments here. Is this pretty much what motivates you now? What gets you into the studio now? What's kind of inspired you?
I still paint the sharp focused materials. I still do paint those. We'll kind of keep these things maybe right here. I do still work with these. I'm getting ready to make a whole new set. I want to do something with the rice containers from, like, say a Chinese food restaurant. I want to do some sort of thing with that for some reason or another. I love those containers. I think they're so cute. I love them. I might have to build something with them. I don't know. But what I'm doing now is actually I'm building things out of other things and creating some sort of prop of some sort. And it isn't necessarily anything. It's just there, but it seems familiar. So that kind of keeps it in that surrealism sort of approach. I still paint with that very tight quality when I'm working with the oil and the board and working along that line. But I do enjoy the encaustic area. Usually what happens is I'll paint for about 2 weeks with one system, and then I feel this tug in me that I need to do something else. So it's like, okay, that means I need to do this. One of my professors, she said, if something keeps eating at you in your head, just do it and get it out of your system. And she was, oh my gosh, that professor was so profound and so absolutely correct. I had the one professor that said, stay true to yourself. Whatever it is that you are, you have to stay true to yourself. And he was 100% right. And then the other professor that said, if you can feel it just eating here, it's going to keep eating at you and just keep bugging you. So get it out of your system. Every time I've done that, I have created a very good piece. So her particular discussion with me was very, very important too. So really what happens is I get bored fast. Um, which is probably, I do and I don't. I mean, I can stay on painting for 8 or 10 hours a day and not move. I can do that. So it's not like I'm, you know, up and moving around. It's just that I have to kind of keep my interest kind of going. So it means I have to evolve fairly fast, you know, as I do, as I move through these things. But I still enjoy the pairs. I'm kind of sick of them now. I've painted quite a few in the past year, probably 25 paintings of pairs in the past year. So it may be time for me to take a wee bit of a break. And then maybe I'll go back to them a year or two from now, but I'll pick up something else. Like I said, I really want these little containers, you know, from Chinese carryout. You know, it just, they intrigue me because they're so petite, you know, and I like them. They have a funny shape or a cute shape or something like that. So I think I'm going to do something along that line, and then build the things that I want to do as well, along with it. So hopefully that answered the question too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Kelly, for
Thank
joining
you.
us today and for telling us about what's going on in your head with these paintings. And thank you for sharing them with our audiences here in Northern Michigan. So again, those of you in attendance or catching this on Facebook, if you haven't yet, come see us in Petoskey. And just feel really grateful that you were able to join us, Kelly. So thanks so much, and excited to see what you do next.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.